video session where we look at some of the ideas I would have presented in that first session. So I'm not going to go through course content and introduce assignment and grading criteria. We'll do that next week. Likewise, we're not going to be able to start creating shared definitions because we're not all in one room. But I would like you to consider some ideas of what meaning might be. And I'd like you to think about how you can apply those ideas to a particular object from your studio practice. And that's actually what you're going to be doing at the Pitt Rivers and these with your artefacts you're going to be looking at. You'll be looking at them through particular research methodologies. So hopefully this will work sort of hand in hand with what you're doing in your curriculum area to support you in unpicking what this idea of meaning might be. So first of all, we're going to look at some sort of vocabulary of meaning. So signify, convey, denote, designate, indicate, connote, to spell out, to show, to represent. These are all quite useful ideas, and it's worth having a look at some kind of visual dictionary like this and just seeing which words you think are most appropriate when we're talking about the idea of meaning in a visual object, because the visual language is far more complex and far more nuanced than text ever can be. And my feeling is that none of these particular words really convey adequately what the meaning of a piece of visual art can be. So do have a look, see which ones you like. Now, rather than looking at this in class, you will notice that on the web space that we've created, we have this image with some critical questions, and I really would like you to look at this image and consider those questions in relation to it. And then when we meet next week, we can perhaps discuss this in a little bit more detail. So have a look at this. You know, how would you describe it? How would you discuss it? What kind of meanings do you think there might be in that image? And crucially, do you think the artist's intention, the author's intention in creating that object has been communicated to you? We won't look at those. Now, when we think about communication, we've just mentioned the artist and the art object. And a very, very simple model suggests that the artist encodes meanings into an art object. So that's the process of designing the object, what you want to communicate and convey. But there are limitations and critical issues with this model. And of course, the most obvious of those is it doesn't really take into account the viewer, the person looking at the art object. So let's look at only a slightly more complex diagram where the artist is encoding the meanings into the art object and the viewer is decoding those meanings. Again, I'd say this raises more questions than it answers, because is it ever going to be as straightforward a process as this? I mean, what about history? Do we read the same meanings into pieces that were created 400 years ago as the people who made them intended? Lots and lots of questions. And if we look at this idea of encoding and decoding, Stuart Hall is a major theorist in this area, and what he's really saying is that there are multiple viewers, they have multiple decodings of meanings. So the sender, that might be the artist putting something into an art object, and then they will go off to the receiver, 3 people here decoding, and what they read, the meanings they read in that particular object, is going to be dependent on education, gender, ethics, their role in society, the cultural context of the object, and the physical context in which it's being viewed. So have a think about that, and again, see how far you agree with that. Is it complex enough? Does it actually adequately convey the multiplicity of meanings that you might find in an art object? What I'm hoping to do is for us to actually create our own diagram and our own ideas of meaning. We may not be able to do that because we missed the session, but we'll try and return to this later on in the semester. So the questions that these diagrams raise to me: what about the historical context of the object, the geographic context? Do artists know their own meaning anyway? Because some psychoanalytical theories would argue that no, they don't. What about if the image or object references another image or object? And we're going to be looking at that particular idea in more detail next week. Also, very, very appropriate for contemporary society. How does this example work if the art object itself is a collaborative project or an installation? One of the images we might have looked at is a textile-based craft work, which is collaborative, whereupon the person who curated the project sent out lots of tiny patchwork squares, and everybody embroidered kind of messages and meanings on the back of them. They were sewn together. So how can you say that something like that even has an artist's intention? The artist who organised that project was very clear that she was curating the meanings of other people. We're going to go back to a model that perhaps might be useful when you're looking at a piece of art or a craft object, whatever it might be. And that is this idea of the artist who encodes the meaning into the art object. Now the viewer here decodes the meaning and also encodes meanings back into the art object. So the viewer isn't just a decoder of meaning, but part of the whole meaning making process in themselves. And there are examples of this, and we'll come to some tangible examples in a minute. But I'd like you to consider two questions. First, what are the implications of this for you, the maker of the object? And also, how far is it likely that certain makers deliberately create ambiguous images in order to attract multiple decodings? So 2 questions there. And what I'd like us to consider, we're going to look at the safety pin, just for doing this as a video. So the safety pin, it's a practical item, but punk took the safety pin, they made it into an emblem of rebellion. So we've got this very sort of practical item, probably traditionally associated with kind of traditional ideas of femininity, of sewing, of being neat and tidy, and that's appropriated by the punk movement. So rather than just holding this one meaning, it's not just an object that has a purpose, it's an object with a particular cultural meaning that then has another cultural meaning placed upon it. And this hopefully gives you an idea of how, this isn't a created object by an artist, but how society can take a meaning and decode it but encode different meanings into that particular object. Burberry is another very good example, because I'm sure Burberry didn't intend to have the meaning of chav encoded into them. They intended to encode meanings of kind of luxury and aristocracy, and then that particular cultural artifact was appropriated by a particular cultural subgroup who encoded different meanings in it and then put those meanings back onto the article. So it's far more complex than this, and it's something it would have been lovely to discuss properly in class, but as an idea, that's one of how the meaning making process can work 2 ways. And Stuart Hall, the great theorist, suggested that when viewers look at something, there are 3 positions that they can take. Now he's assuming that there's a particular meaning that the makers of something want to encode in something here, and there's a dominant hegemonic reading, which is that a reader identifies with the dominant message of an image or text in an unquestioning manner. There's a negotiated reading, which that viewers can negotiate an interpretation from the image and its dominant meaning, so they might buy into some of those meanings but not into all of them. And there's an oppositional reading, which is somebody who takes a different reading from that image. They disagree with the position that's embodied by the image, or they reject it altogether, so they might ignore it. Now, we will return to this later on. It isn't something that you need to be too concerned about at the moment, but if you're interested in communication theory, I can't really produce anything without mentioning Hall, because he's such a huge theorist in this area. So if you're a little bit interested, he's the man to go and look at. We've got representation on the critical studies pages of StudentNet. In our key text, which I will talk to you about next week, it's called Practices of Looking. This is summed up, and what I'm trying to say is summed up really, is the idea that consumers are active meaning makers. They're not merely passive recipients in the process of decoding images. So when you put something out there, when you're looking at something, meanings will be created and generated by the people who look at it. So have a think about that when you're going round the gallery and the exhibitions and the Pitt Rivers today, and think about the meanings that you're placing on objects. Think perhaps about the distance between yourself and that object and the person who created it. And it's quite interesting, and I think it does have huge implications for yourselves as artists to look at things in this particular way. My conclusion: is the meaning of a work of art something that can be understood primarily in terms of the artist's stated intention? Can we say that the meaning of a work of art is all to do with the artist, what they wanted to communicate? Or is it something that's constantly changing and part of a wider process? And if so, how can we best approach analysing the artwork in order to write about its meaning, which is what we're going to be doing? I mean, personally, I think the artist's stated intention has a huge place in how we can understand an object. It's one of the things we do when we go to a gallery. We'll look at a description of what the artist wanted to encode, and that will either validate our feelings towards the object or perhaps go in opposition to the object. This is what we were talking about with these different meanings that the viewer can bring. But have a think about what do you feel about that? Because really, it doesn't matter what I think. You are the people out there who are going to be writing this essay, looking at objects, making objects. So have a think about when you analyse that work of art that you choose, the work of craft, think about how far its meaning can be understood in terms of the artist's intention. And you probably will find that depends hugely on what the object is and who has made it. I really look forward to meeting everybody next week. We'll look at our key text, we'll look at the assignment, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about some of the ideas we explored very briefly today. I hope you have a brilliant day out and come back with lots of images, and please, 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 if you see things that are visually interesting, please post them onto our learning site pages or email them or put them somewhere where I can use them and we can use them in class, because I'm really hoping to build up a bank of images that we can look at sort of from your studio practice that will give you ideas not just for your studio work but ideas of what you can analyse and write about in the essay for Pick 2. Thank you.